Welcome back to the Book Nook. I'm really excited for today's deep dive. We're cracking open Neil Rackham's Spin Selling.
This book is a classic.
Yeah, and it's not just some sales guru spouting opinions, right?
Right, this is based on some seriously hardcore research. I mean, we're talking over 35,000 sales calls analyzed to figure out what actually works when it comes to closing those big, complex deals.
That's a lot of data. And for our listeners, people who are all about maximizing their learning, today we're going to pull out the absolute gold, the stuff you can use right away from all that research.
We're talking actionable insights. Forget the old school sales tricks and cheesy closing lines.
Yeah, none of that. This deep dive is about a whole new way of thinking about how to make major sales happen.
And I think what's so fascinating about Rackham's work is that it challenges a lot of the conventional wisdom about selling.
Yeah, totally.
He basically says, those techniques you might use for a quick, small sale, those might actually backfire when you're dealing with bigger, more complex deals where the stakes are higher.
Makes sense, right?
You need a different approach, and the book is all about backing that up with evidence. I mean, he's looked at what top salespeople actually do in all sorts of companies, real-world stuff.
Exactly. And that's what we're all out here, right? So what? Like, what can you actually do with this information?
Right.
Whether you're in sales directly or trying to get buy-in for a project at work or just generally wanting to be more persuasive in those conversations that really matter.
Absolutely.
We're breaking it all down.
And I think a great place to start is how Rackham looks at the structure of a typical sales call. He breaks it down into these 4 distinct stages.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are the stages?
So first you got the preliminaries. This is like your initial warm-up, making that connection.
Okay.
Then you move into the investigating stage. This is where you're really trying to understand the other person's needs,
Okay.
what their pain points are.
Okay.
After that, you have demonstrating capability, where you show how what you offer can help them.
Makes sense.
And finally, you've got obtaining commitment. This is about getting them to agree to something, to move forward in some way.
So that's where the classic closing the deal comes in, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, so much of traditional sales training really hammers on that last stage. You have to take a killer closer, always be closing, that kind of thing.
Oh, I've heard that so many times, always be closing, but I'm guessing Rackham has a different take on that.
He does, especially when it comes to larger sales. It's not that getting that final commitment isn't important, but the research shows that the investigating stage, that's where the magic really happens.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah, if you don't do a good job in that investigating stage, everything else you do later on, it just falls flat.
It's like you're building on a shaky foundation.
Exactly. It's like you're building on sand. And, what's interesting is that Rackham found that even when sales managers thought their people were weak closers, the real issue often turned out to be that they weren't skilled at uncovering the customer's needs in the first place. They were just jumping ahead to solutions before they really understood the problem.
So it all comes back to that deep understanding.
Absolutely. It's the bedrock of success in those larger, more complex sales.
Okay, so this investigating stage is clearly crucial.
It is.
So what's the secret sauce? How do we do it effectively?
Well, this is where Rackham introduces what he calls the spin model.
I've heard of this.
Yeah, and it's brilliant. It's basically a framework for conducting a really effective investigation, and it's an acronym. SPIN stands for 4 specific types of questions that successful salespeople ask during this stage.
All right, break it down for us. What are the spin questions?
So the first type is situation questions. These are pretty basic fact-finding questions about the buyer's current situation, like what software are you currently using for project management, or how many employees are in this division, getting the lay of the land.
Okay, the basics.
But here's the thing. Less experienced salespeople tend to overuse situation questions.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they get bogged down in details that might not be all that relevant. And it can bore the buyer, or even worse, make them impatient.
Right, no one wants to feel like they're being interrogated.
Exactly. And the research shows that top salespeople, they ask way fewer situation questions.
So less is more with those. What's next?
The next type is problem questions. Now, these are where we start to get to the good stuff.
Okay, tell me more.
These questions are all about uncovering the buyer's pain points, their frustrations, the things they're not happy with. So instead of just asking, what kind of system do you use, you might ask, what are some of the challenges you're facing with your current project management software?
Oh, I see.
Or are you finding that it's difficult to keep everyone on the same page with your current setup? You're digging a little deeper.
You're getting to the heart of the matter.
Right, and these problem questions are so much more effective than just those basic situation questions.
Because you're starting to uncover those needs, those things that they might want to change or improve.
Exactly. You're starting to identify those potential areas where you can offer value.
Okay, so we've moved from understanding their situation to identifying their problems. What's the next step in the spin model?
So once you've identified some problems, you don't just stop there.
Oh.
You got to take it a step further. That's where implication questions come in.
Ooh, I like the sound of this.
These are some of the most powerful questions in the spin model.
Okay, why is that?
They're designed to help the buyer see the consequences of those problems, the ripple effects, if they don't address them.
So you're making them realize the true cost of inaction.
Exactly. So, for example, if they said they're having trouble keeping everyone on track with projects, you might ask, what impact does that have on your team's productivity?
Mm.
Or how does that affect your ability to meet deadlines?
Ooh, yeah.
Or even, could that lead to increased stress and frustration for your team members? You're getting them to think about the bigger picture.
Right. It's not just a minor annoyance anymore. It's something that's actually impacting their business.
Exactly. And Rackham gives this great example of the book. Let's say you're selling a new car,
Okay.
and the buyer mentions that their current car is getting old.
Uh-huh.
So instead of just jumping in with all the features of your new models, you might ask an implication question like, doesn't owning a 7-year-old car mean you're probably spending a lot more on gas and repairs?
Oh, I get it. You're getting them to think about the hidden costs they might not even be fully aware of.
Exactly. And that makes them more receptive to hearing about the benefits of a new car.
Brilliant. So implication questions really help to amplify the importance of those problems.
They do. They're like a magnifying glass. And the best salespeople, they use them strategically to build up the perceived seriousness of the problem in the buyer's mind.
Okay, so we've got situation questions, problem questions, implication questions. What's the fourth and final piece of the spin puzzle?
Okay, so by now you got the buyer thinking, wow, these problems are bigger than I realized. They're primed and ready for a solution.
They're hooked.
Right. And that's where need-payoff questions come in.
Okay, what are those all about?
These are the questions that shift the focus from the problems themselves to the value and benefits of solving them.
So you're getting them to think about the positive outcomes.
Exactly. And here's the key. You're getting them to articulate those benefits themselves.
That's interesting.
Because let's be honest, nobody likes to be told what's good for them. But when they come to that realization themselves,
It's way more powerful.
way more powerful. So, for example, instead of saying, our software will streamline your workflow, you might ask, if you could eliminate those bottlenecks in your current process, how much time and money do you think you could save?
That's so smart.
Or imagine if your team could easily collaborate on projects in real time, how would that impact your overall efficiency and morale? You're painting a picture of a better future and letting them fill in the details.
You're guiding them to their own ha-ha moment.
Exactly. And Rackham found that top-performing salespeople, they ask way more need-payoff questions than their average counterparts.
It's all about getting the buyer to sell themselves on the solution.
It really is.
Wow. So to recap, the spin model, situation, problem, implication, and need payoff questions, it's such a structured and insightful approach to having a sales conversation.
It is, and it shows why simply uncovering problems, what Rackham calls implied needs, isn't always enough, especially with those big sales.
Implied needs?
Yeah, it's like, they might say, oh, it's a bit of a hassle to manage all these spreadsheets. That's an implied need. But to really win those bigger deals, you need to move beyond those surface-level problems.
I'm listening.
You need to uncover what he calls explicit needs.
Explicit needs. What's the difference?
An explicit need is a clear statement from the buyer about something they want or need that your product or service can directly fulfill. It's like them saying, we need a system that can automate our reporting and give us real-time insights into our data.
Okay, so it's much more specific and actionable.
Exactly. And the goal of that investigating stage, using those spin questions, is to transform those initial implied needs into much stronger, more compelling explicit needs.
That makes sense.
It's like taking a vague wish and turning it into a concrete objective.
Right, because in a larger sale, you need to justify that investment. And a vague problem just isn't going to cut it.
Precisely. You need those strong, clearly articulated needs.
All right, so we've spent a lot of time on this investigating stage, which clearly Rackham sees as crucial.
It's a foundation.
But what about the other end of the spectrum, that always be closing mentality that's so prevalent in sales?
Oh yeah, the ABCs of selling. Well, this is another area where Rackham's research really challenges the traditional wisdom.
I'm ready for it. Hit me with it.
Okay, so brace yourself. He found that in larger sales, there was actually a negative correlation between the number of traditional closing techniques used and success.
Wait, what? You're saying the more you try to close, the less likely you are to close?
In larger sales, often yes. The data showed that those high-pressure tactics, they just don't work as well when you're dealing with bigger decisions and more sophisticated buyers.
It's like they can smell the desperation a mile away.
It is, and it can make them feel pressured and uncomfortable, which is the last thing you want.
So if it's not about using all those closing techniques, what's the key to getting commitment in these larger sales?
It's about shifting your focus from trying to force a decision to creating the right conditions for a natural progression.
I like that. So what does that look like in practice?
Well, first, you need to set the right objectives for each interaction. In a larger sale, you're rarely going to get a signed contract on the first call.
Right, it's a process.
It is. So instead of aiming for an immediate close, your goal should be to achieve what Rackham calls an advance.
An advance.
An advance is basically an agreement from the buyer to take a specific action that moves the sale forward.
Like what? Give me some examples.
It could be something like agreeing to a follow-up meeting with other key stakeholders, scheduling a product demo, agreeing to a pilot program, or even just giving you access to a higher-level decision maker. It's about getting them to commit to a concrete next step.
Okay, so you're not necessarily going for the whole enchilada right away, but you're getting them to buy into the process.
Exactly. And he makes this really important distinction between advances and what he calls continuations.
Continuations, what are those?
A continuation is basically just a positive comment from the buyer, but without any real commitment to action. It's like them saying, that sounds interesting, or we'll definitely keep you in mind.
Ah, I see. So it might feel good in the moment, but it doesn't actually move the needle.
Right. A continuation might give you a warm and fuzzy feeling, but it's not a reliable indicator of future success.
You need that concrete commitment, that advance.
Exactly. And to help you obtain those advances, Rackham outlines 4 key actions.
This is getting good. I'm all ears. Lay 'em on me.
Okay, the first one is super important. Make sure you've addressed all the buyer's key concerns.
So don't leave any loose ends.
Right. You want to make sure they feel heard and that you've covered everything that's important to them.
Okay, makes sense. What's next?
Next, you need to summarize the benefits.
How does that work?
This is where all that work you did in the investigating stage pays off.
Ah, I see.
You want to clearly and concisely reiterate how your solution directly addresses those explicit needs they've already identified.
Okay.
Remind them of the value you're bringing to the table.
So it's not just about listing features or talking about your product in a general sense.
No, it's about connecting the dots between what you offer and what they specifically need.
It's all about relevance.
It is. And then the third action is to propose a realistic and appropriate level of commitment, that logical next step that makes sense in the context of the conversation.
So you're not asking them to jump through hoops.
Right. You want it to feel like a natural progression, something they're comfortable agreeing to.
Okay. And the fourth action?
The fourth action is all about making sure that the proposed commitment is realistic and something they're actually likely to do.
You don't want to set them up for failure.
Exactly. It's about building trust and momentum. You're not trying to strong-arm them into anything.
Okay, so gaining commitment in larger sales is much more nuanced and collaborative than just hitting them with a hard close.
Absolutely. It's about building a relationship, understanding their needs, and guiding them towards a solution that makes sense for them.
So much more strategic.
It is.
Now, earlier you mentioned the demonstrating capability stage.
Right.
In traditional sales, there's a lot of emphasis on features, advantages, and benefits.
Oh, yeah, the FABs.
How does Rackham's research inform how we should approach this, particularly in larger sales where we need to be really thoughtful about the information we're presenting?
So traditional sales training often makes a big distinction between features, advantages, and benefits.
Fill us in.
Features are basically the facts about your product or service, what it does. Advantages are how those features can be used or how they might help a customer in a general sense. And benefits are how your product specifically addresses an explicit need that the customer has already articulated.
Okay, so benefits are directly tied to those needs you've been talking about.
Exactly. And while advantages might have some impact in the early stages of a sale, their power really diminishes as you move forward, especially in larger sales.
Interesting.
Rackham's research found that in larger sales, benefits, what he calls type B benefits, have a much bigger impact on achieving those crucial advances and ultimately closing the deal.
So it's not enough to just talk about the cool features your product has or how it could potentially help someone.
Right. You need to make that explicit connection between what you offer and the specific needs they've already expressed.
It's all about relevance, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, presenting too many features, especially when you're introducing a new product, can actually backfire.
Really? Why is that?
It can overwhelm the buyer and even lead to objections.
Makes sense.
So the key is to first really understand the problems they're facing, using those spin questions to develop those clear, explicit needs.
Okay.
Once you have that solid understanding, then you can present the benefits of your offering in a way that directly addresses those needs.
It's like you're giving them a tailored solution, not just a generic pitch.
Exactly. And that's what resonates with buyers, especially in larger sales.
So it's all about being strategic and making sure every piece of information you share is directly relevant to their needs.
It is.
Now, we've all faced objections at some point in our lives, whether in sales or just in general. How does Rackham's work inform a more effective and perhaps proactive approach to objections?
This is another really insightful part of the book. Rackham found that the most successful salespeople, they don't just focus on handling objections when they come up.
What do?
They focus on preventing them in the first place.
Objection prevention. I like that.
It's a much more proactive approach.
So how do you prevent objections before they even arise?
By thoroughly developing the buyer's needs, using those spin questions before you even start presenting your solution.
Okay, I'm following you.
When the buyer truly understands the problem, its implications, and the value of solving it, they're much less likely to object to your solution.
Because you've already addressed those potential concerns.
Exactly. It's like building a solid foundation so that the structure can stand strong.
I love that analogy. So a strong investigating stage is your best defense against objections.
It is.
Now, you mentioned earlier that in larger sales, there's often more than one person involved in the decision-making process.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You rarely just have one person signing off on those big deals.
This brings up an important concept that Rackham talks about, internal selling.
Internal selling.
Can you explain what that is and how we can facilitate it?
So internal selling is basically the idea that in larger sales, a lot of the selling actually happens internally within the customer's organization.
So it's like your contact has to sell your solution to their own team.
Exactly. And you might not even be present for those conversations.
So how can we influence those internal discussions?
This is where those explicit needs come back into play.
Okay.
You need to make sure that your initial contacts, the people you're directly interacting with, really understand the benefits of your solution and specifically how those benefits connect to those explicit needs they've identified.
They need to be able to articulate the value to their colleagues.
Exactly. Because if they can't clearly explain why your solution is the right choice, it's going to be much harder to get buy-in from the rest of the team.
Right.
One really helpful strategy here is to actually have your contact explain the benefits back to you in their own words.
Interesting. So it's like a little rehearsal for those internal conversations.
It is, and it also helps you to make sure they really get it.
Brilliant. You're essentially equipping them to be your internal champions.
Exactly.
So much of this comes back to understanding those needs.
It all starts there.
Finally, for our listeners who are excited to put all this into practice, what advice does Rackham offer on the best way to learn and implement these new skills?
He gives 4 really practical tips for learning any new skill, actually, not just selling skills.
Okay, I love practical tips. Give us the goods.
Okay, the first one is to focus on practicing one behavior at a time. Don't try to change everything all at once. Pick one specific skill from the SPIN model, like asking more effective implication questions, and really hone in on that.
Okay, small steps.
Exactly. The second tip is to prioritize quantity over quality in the beginning.
What does that mean?
It means don't worry about being perfect right away. Just focus on doing the new behavior as often as you can. The more you do it, the more natural it will become.
Okay.
The third tip is to practice in safe situations until you feel more confident. Don't experiment with those high-stakes conversations right out of the gate. Start with smaller interactions, maybe with colleagues or friends, where the pressure is lower.
Right, get those reps in.
Exactly. And the fourth and final tip, and this is so important, take the time to reflect on your interactions afterwards.
So it's not just about doing it, it's about analyzing how you did it.
Right. Think about what worked well, what you could have done differently, and what you learned from the experience. Rackham says that top salespeople are really diligent about this kind of self-reflection.
So it's all about continuous improvement.
It is.
Wow, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into spin selling. For you, the listener, what are some of the key takeaways?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that shifting your focus from that final close to the earlier investigation can make a huge difference in your success, especially in larger sales.
Absolutely. And mastering the spin model gives you a powerful framework for doing that effectively.
And I would encourage you to think about your own past experiences.
Good point.
What conversations come to mind where you could have used a more spin-based approach? Maybe a time when you were trying to get buy-in for an idea or persuade someone to see things your way.
And remember, those implication and need-payoff questions can be incredibly effective in all sorts of situations, not just sales.
Right, they're great for getting people to think more deeply about an issue and articulate the value of a solution for themselves.
So powerful. This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about and some really practical tools to start using.
I hope so.
And for you, the listener, what insights resonated most with you? What questions has this raised for you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe we can even do a future deep dive exploring how these principles can be applied in different contexts.
That's a great idea.
For now, thank you for joining us in the Book Nook. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring the fascinating world of communication.
And until next time, happy reading.